Welcome to Prelude to Ulysses. This is Alex Reed's Norman Mailer's Ancient Evenings. This is Book 1, The Book of One Dead Man, Part 2. Unlike my other channel parts, I tried to get into less shenanigans and just read through this book because it's awesome. Part 2. I already tried to do this, but I got a bloody nose. So here's part 2 of part 2. 2. I was in the most peculiar situation. I still did not know who I was, nor how old I might be. Was I mature and powerful, or young and in the beginning of my strength? It hardly seemed to matter. I shrugged and began to walk, taking, for whatever reason, a path through the necropolis, and as I meandered, I began to explain to myself what I saw, or so I would put it, for I felt in the oddest position, and like a stranger to my own everyday knowledge. Before me, I must say, was no more to see than the straight streets of the cemetery in the moonlight, a view without great charm, unless there is charm to be found in high value. Cubit for cubit, the city of the dead had the dearest plots in all of Memphis, or at least that is what I certainly remember. Wandering down the alleys of our monotonous necropolis, sauntering past the shuttered door of one tomb, then another, I began, for no reason I could give, to think of a friend who had died recently, the dearest of my friends. This memory seemed to say, and the most absurd and violent death. The dearest friend, that's what the memory seemed to say. Okay. Now I had no more than to wonder whether his tomb was anywhere near about, and I was visited with more recollections. My friend, I was ready to think, came from a powerful family. His father, if I could recall, had once served as the overseer of the cosmetic box. I would die, I thought, before lusting after such titles myself. Still, that was not a career to be sneered at altogether. Our Ramses, if I remembered correctly, was as vain as a beautiful girl and detested any flaw in his appearance. Of course, with such a father, my friend, whose name I fear still eluded me, was certainly wealthy and noble. Poor entombed bugger. He must be at the least a descendant of the great Ramses. Yes, the one I could recall, who died something like 100 years ago. Our own Ramses II, he had ended as a very old man, with very many wives, and more than 100 recorded sons and 50 daughters. They produced ancestors in such numbers that today you cannot begin to estimate how many officers and priests are Ramsesides. At least half of their line. For truth, hardly a rich woman in Memphis or Thebes will fail to offer one bona fide cheek of her buttocks. Royal as the pharaohs, and she will not fail to let you know. To be descended from Ramses II may not be exceptional, but it is indispensable, at least if she wants a family plot in the necropolis. Then she had better be at least by half a Rameside. Rameside. I don't know, man. In fact, you cannot even buy a tomb in the Western Shade if you are not. And that is only the first requirement in such commerce amongst Memphis matrons. There are not enough plots, so they go to great lengths. For instance, the mother of my dead friend, the matron Hathfertiti, was always prepared to trade. If the price was good enough, the sarcophagus of an ancestor could be transferred to an interior tomb. inferior to, oh my God, or even shipped downriver to another necropolis. Of course, one had to ask, who was the deceased? How substantial was his curse? That was the unspoken part of this transaction. You had to be ready to take on a few malevolent oaths, but some were ready to welcome them, if they were terrible enough to bring the price down. For example, Hathfertiti had been bold enough to sell the tomb of her dead grandfather. Concerning this dead relative, her husband's grandfather, who happened incidentally to be her own grandfather, since she was certainly her husband's sister, it was told to the buyer that old Menenhetet had been the kindest and most benign of men. His vice was that he could not harm his enemies. His curse need hardly be feared. What torture of the truth! In secret, it was whispered that Menenhetet had been known to eat fried scorpions with bat dung. Just so great was his need to protect himself against the curses of the powerful. He had had a mighty life, I seem to remember. Now the buyer to whom Hathfertiti was selling this plot, an ambitious little official, was not untypical. He knew the best protection against any evil spell was for a petty Ramesside like himself to own a fine tomb. So long as he had none to offer his family, every visit of his wife and daughters to the better homes of Memphi was bound to fail. They simply had no position in the ranks of the dead. So they were living already with a curse. They were snubbed. For what is a curse but an unfair theft of strength? Whatever is attempted in the way of improving your position brings back less than the effort exerted. Whatever is attempted in the way of improving your position brings back less than the effort exerted. This Ramesside's wife and daughters began to weep so often that he was ready to take his chances with the wrath of his dead grandfather. Maybe if he knew more about the old man, Menenhetet, he would have waited. But he felt the awe of acquiring possession that is beyond one's means, but absolutely fashionable. My recollection of these transactions seemed to have had a purpose. Now I remember my friend's name. It is Menenhetet II. The name is, by the way, a typical example of a family affectation. Menenhetet II, as though his mother were a queen. Yet I do not know if he was so royal as that. All I remember is that he was a hellion among us, his friends, and on certain nights he was so full of wild impulses that he could have summoned demons. I think some of us began to regret his nickname, Ka, that we gave to him. It seemed clever at the time, since it not only means twice for Menenhetet II, but also our good Egyptian name for your double when you are dead. And the double has a changeable personality, it is said, so it fit him. With our friend Ka, you could never know when he would take on a lion, but then he also liked to swear vile things against the gods, and that part left us uneasy. There is not much piety among us, far from it, and part of our pride was to be man enough to take the name of God in vain. But Ka went too far. We did not like to share his blasphemies when they were uttered. After all, for no better reason than ungovernable rage at his mother. When Hathfertiti sold the tomb of Menenhetet I to the petty Ramesside, Ka soon learned that it had been his tomb as well, at least by the terms of the will of his great-grandfather Menenhetet I. So his name's Menenhetet II, but it's his great-grandfather that was the first. Okay. Now, standing in the moonlight of the necropolis, full of sorrow, I could hardly comprehend for the death of Menenhetet II. I do not know if I was there when Hathfertiti spoke to him about the tomb, although I would suppose that Ka was left nothing. All the same, the details are not clear to me. It is better to state that this is what I seem to recall. Should we say I was like a boat poling my way into the harbor through the openings of a fog? Now, even as I took stock of my position here, on one of the meanest alleys of the necropolis, I had the impression that I was not far from the cheap plot Hathfertiti had come to purchase in a great hurry after his sudden death. Recollections came again of a pious funeral, but a mean tomb. Into my ear now came the sound of Hathfertiti's voice, telling all who would listen that Ka's desire was to be on the lowest edge of the western shade. That was a scandal. As everyone knew, Hathfertiti was simply too stingy to pay the price for a decent chamber. Still, Hathfertiti kept to the same sad tale. Many had kept having a dream, she said, that he must rest at first in a mean abode, but when he was ready to move, she would receive a message in her sleep. Then she would shift him to a fine property. All this was uttered in such loud lamentation that those who heard her were repelled. It was no part of our etiquette, after all, to encourage any of the seven souls, shades, and spirits of a dead man to pay. It was no part of our etiquette, after all, to encourage any of the seven souls, shades, and spirits of a dead man to pay visits back to the living. Uh-oh. The aim, supposedly, of a funeral is to send all seven off with comfort. Seven what? With comfort to the land of the dead. So we had a natural fear of a man who had gone out violently. His ghost could keep up an you know that word, right? We all do. Obstiparious relation to his family. It is precisely at such funerals that the bereaved must take great pains to placate the dead man rather than scorn him. It was foolhardy that, in that case, for Hathfertiti to avow that she would soon shift her son's coffin to her best crypt. Everyone knew she was keeping that tomb for herself. We even wondered if her real intent might be to goad our men-headed too into the tormented journeys of a ghost. Worse, the funeral might have been lavish, but the tomb itself was so mean that grave robbers would hardly fear to break it open. The curse that robbers take on themselves at the door of a poor tomb is, after all, rarely forceful. That is because the greater benevolence is between the poor departed and the relatives who left him so poor. One had to wonder that if Hathfertiti was making certain that the vault of her son would be defiled. I had come to the head of the alley that led to Many's vault, and from there had a view. Many of these tombs were no larger than shepherds' huts, although only in the necropolis do you find such huts of marble. But each roof was a miniature pyramid with a hole on the steep front. By that alone you could know if you were in the necropolis, since the hole was the window for the Ba. If every dead man had a double, and we knew it as his Ka, he also had his own intimate little soul, the Ba. And the most intimate of the seven powers and spirits. Okay. This Ba had the body of a bird and the face of the deceased. That was the reason I remembered. I remembered now for the arched little window in these steep little pyramids. An exit for the Ba. Yes, it was coming back to me, of course. Any bird I could see in a tower window here would be the Ba of whoever was in the sarcophagus below. For which common bird was likely to come near when necropolis ghosts were about? And I shivered. Necropolis ghosts were hideous. All those unappeased officials and unrewarded warriors, priests and unjustly punished, and noblemen betrayed by their near relatives, or even more common, the ghosts of robbers killed in the act of violating a tomb. Worst of all, the victims of the robbers. All those mummified mummies whose wrappings had been violated, while the thieves poked about for jewels. Such mummies proved to smell the worst. Think of what vengeful corruption has to be present in any well wrapped corpse that succumbs eventually to rot, after rot has been prevented. That has to double the effect. Whatever. Okay. I now met a ghost. He was not 3 doors from Many's tomb, and I must say he had a malignity to leave me faint. Close to the worst kind, he was recognizable by his rags as a grave robber. He was also a proprietor of a stench beyond measure, and now descended on me. In the moonlight, I saw a wretch with no hands and a leper's nose, collapsed into 3 tatters. A misery, that nose, a mockery of the triple phallus of Osiris, Lord of the Dead, yet a nose still able to twitch beneath his wild yellow eyes. He was certainly a full ghost. I could see him as clearly as my hand, yet I could see through him. "For whom do you look?" he cried out, and his breath, if it had consisted of dead crabs rotting in the worst mud of the Nile, would have been a fragrance compared to the horrors that lived on his wind. I merely lifted my hand to drive him away. He scuttled backwards. "Do not go into the tomb of Menenhedet I."